I think he is the most unique guitar player and the most, probably the most devoted. I mean, from what I know of Jeff, you know, he's either fixing his cars or playing the guitar. There's no in-between for him.
Jeff Beck is remembered as one of the greatest guitarists of all time, a true innovator who could bend sound into something no one else had even imagined. But behind the mastery was also a restless, often ruthless critic. Beck wasn't content to just play his own music. He spent his entire life listening, dissecting, and judging the work of others. If a band impressed him, he'd dive deep, sometimes obsessing over their ideas for years. But if they didn't measure up, he wasn't shy about dismissing them with a sharp comment that could cut deeper than one of his riffs. What made Beck unique was his combination of admiration and rivalry. He could praise a band's ingenuity in one breath and dismiss their weaknesses in the next. He was always searching for authenticity, music that carried risk, danger, and personality. Anything that felt too safe, too polished, or too obvious, he had no patience for it. That's what makes this story so fascinating. Today, we're looking at the 10 bands and artists who caught Beck's attention the most, whether through admiration, rivalry, or outright rejection. Some of them inspired him, others pushed him to prove himself, and a few he simply couldn't stand. Together, they paint a picture of an artist who defined himself not just by what he played, but by what he refused to imitate. So let's dive into the countdown. At number 10, we begin with a group of instrumental pioneers whose influence ran deeper than anyone expected. Number 10, The Ventures. Before Jeff Beck was bending notes into sounds no one had ever heard before, he was a teenager sitting in his bedroom with a cheap guitar, obsessing over The Ventures. Known for their clean instrumental hits like Walk Don't Run and Perfidia, The Ventures didn't need vocals to make a song stick. That idea that a guitar could carry the whole story planted itself in Beck's mind early and never left. Beck admired their ability to make simplicity feel powerful. Every note had weight, every bend carried emotion, and every riff seemed designed to hook the listener without wasting time. Every note counts when there's nowhere to hide, he once told a friend, summing up what made The Ventures' music so important to him. That mindset would become one of the guiding principles of his own playing. But admiration didn't mean imitation. Beck studied their music, but he also saw its limits. He wanted to take that stripped-down purity and inject it with danger, distortion, feedback, whammy bar dives, anything that could make a guitar sound alive in ways The Ventures never dared. In a way, they were the launch pad for his imagination. Stories from his early career often mention how Beck would use Ventures records almost like textbooks, slowing them down and replaying sections until he could unlock the mechanics behind the magic. Yet when he hit the stage with the Yardbirds, he immediately veered into wilder territory, determined to show that he could outpace his heroes. To Beck, the Ventures represented both respect and challenge. He respected their precision, their ability to tell stories without a single word. But he also challenged himself to move past them, to prove that guitar music didn't have to be polite or restrained. In that way, the Ventures were both mentors and rivals, even if they never knew it. They were the band that lit the spark. But for Beck, sparks were never enough. He wanted fire, and that pursuit would define everything that came after. Number 9, Cream. When Cream stormed onto the scene in the late 60s with Eric Clapton, Jack Bruce, and Ginger Baker, they were hailed as the first true supergroup. Their mix of blues and psychedelic rock was loud, heavy, and uncompromising. But for Jeff Beck, Cream wasn't just another band. They were a measuring stick. Beck and Clapton had already shared history in the Yardbirds, and their paths were destined to cross again, this time as rivals. Beck admired Cream's boldness. They were loud, they were experimental, and they made no apologies for stretching songs into sprawling jams. But he also bristled at what he saw as excess. Beck valued precision and chaos. Every moment on stage had to matter. To him, Cream sometimes sounded like three great musicians fighting to be heard at the same time. Power without precision is just noise, Beck once remarked, a thinly veiled jab at their reputation for volume over clarity. The rivalry was especially sharp with Clapton. Fans often debated who was the better guitarist, Clapton's blues purity or Beck's sonic experimentation. Clapton had the praise of critics who dubbed him God, but Beck quietly sneered at the idea. He felt Clapton played it safe, sticking to familiar blues frameworks, while he himself was trying to push the guitar into uncharted territory. Still, Beck wasn't dismissive of Cream entirely. He respected their daring and their willingness to shock audiences, even if he thought they sometimes lost control of their own ambition. When he did compliment Clapton, it was usually backhanded, praising his tone or phrasing, then undercutting it by calling it predictable. The tension between admiration and disdain was a hallmark of their relationship. Behind the scenes, promoters often stoked the fire by trying to book Beck's groups alongside Cream, knowing the rivalry would attract crowds. Beck, however, was selective about sharing stages. He didn't want to be seen as following in Clapton's wake. He wanted to outshine him on his own terms. For Beck, Cream represented both a rival and a warning. Brilliance can easily tip into indulgence if you don't keep the fire under control. And for someone as demanding as Beck, that line was everything. Number 8, the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds were more than just another stop on Jeff Beck's career path. They were the crucible where his reputation as a guitar innovator was forged. When Beck replaced Eric Clapton in 1965, he stepped into a band already buzzing with expectation. For a while, it worked. His experiments with distortion, fuzz, and feedback pushed the group into uncharted sonic territory. But Beck was never entirely comfortable. To him, the Yardbirds were both a blessing and a burden. On one hand, the band gave him a platform. Songs like Heart Full of Soul and Shapes of Things showed off his willingness to break rules and make the guitar scream, whisper, and cry in ways fans had never heard before. Critics called him revolutionary. On the other hand, Beck often felt trapped by the pop structures the band was expected to deliver. He wanted chaos and danger. The record label wanted hits. That tension followed him every time he stepped on stage. Beck himself once compared joining the Yardbirds to inheriting a perfectly tuned race car. The machine was already built, but everyone was watching to see if he could drive it faster and wilder than the last guy. That pressure weighed heavily on him. Every solo had to prove something. Every new sound had to top what Clapton had left behind. The clash between Beck's restless creativity and the band's commercial obligations came to a head on tour. Accounts from bandmates describe Beck as temperamental, sometimes storming off stage mid-performance if he felt things weren't working. For a band chasing mainstream success, that unpredictability was a nightmare. For Beck, it was simply non-negotiable. He refused to play it safe. Ultimately, his tenure with the Yardbirds was short-lived, lasting barely 2 years. But in that time, he left behind a blueprint for guitarists who wanted to push beyond the ordinary. Even if he felt stifled, his innovations with the band became a cornerstone of his legacy. The Yardbirds gave Beck his first real taste of fame, but also convinced him that he'd never be satisfied coloring inside the lines. From then on, he would chase freedom above everything else. Number 7, King Crimson. By the late 60s, progressive rock was beginning to take shape, and no band embodied that movement more than King Crimson. Their debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King, stunned critics and musicians alike with its complexity and ambition. Jeff Beck was among those who took notice. To him, King Crimson represented a new kind of challenge, music that wasn't just about riffs or solos, but about constructing vast, intricate sonic landscapes. Beck admired their fearlessness. While many bands were still content to follow blues-based formulas, Crimson dove headfirst into experimental arrangements, shifting time signatures, and orchestral textures. It was music that required discipline, something Beck valued even when he didn't always follow it himself. He once told a friend they're building worlds, not just songs, capturing his fascination with their approach. Yet that admiration was tinged with frustration. Beck reportedly approached Robert Fripp about collaborating in the early 70s, intrigued by the idea of merging Crimson's structural precision with his own boundary-breaking guitar work. Fripp, however, declined. Whether out of disinterest or a clash of egos, the rejection stung Beck, who saw it as a missed opportunity to prove himself in a more cerebral arena. The brush with Crimson pushed Beck into a period of deep study. He began experimenting more heavily with theory, technique, and new technology, determined to show that he could keep pace with the avant-garde. Albums like Blow by Blow reflect that influence, structured yet adventurous, disciplined yet unpredictable. King Crimson had set a bar, and Beck was determined to reach it in his own way. At the same time, he remained critical. While he respected their ambition, he sometimes felt their music leaned too far into the cerebral, sacrificing raw energy for intellectual complexity. For Beck, a song had to live and breathe, not just impress on paper. He admired them, but he didn't want to become them. King Crimson may have never shared a stage with Jeff Beck, but their presence loomed over his career. They were a reminder of both what he admired and what he refused to copy. Number 6, the Beatles. The Beatles changed everything in the 1960s, from songwriting and recording to the way music was marketed worldwide. Jeff Beck couldn't ignore them, and in fact, he didn't want to. For all his rebelliousness, Beck was fascinated by what the band was doing in the studio. When they began pushing beyond simple love songs into experimental production, Beck recognized kindred spirits, artists who weren't afraid to risk alienating their audience in order to evolve. One story that circulates in rock history is that Beck was invited to a listening session for Revolver. He reportedly sat quietly through the playback, then spent the rest of the evening peppering producer George Martin with technical questions. He wanted to know how they got those tones, how they layered those sounds, and what tricks were being used behind the glass. To Beck, the genius wasn't just in the melodies, it was in the construction. What impressed him most was their ability to make the studio itself an instrument. Where others saw a 4-track machine, the Beatles saw limitless possibilities. They're building sonic architectures, Beck supposedly remarked, admiring their capacity to sculpt songs into towering works of art. It was a concept that stayed with him long after the band broke up. Still, his admiration didn't mean uncritical worship. Beck often felt the Beatles were given too much credit for ideas that other musicians were exploring as well. He respected their genius, but remained skeptical of the mythology that built up around them. To him, they were brilliant craftsmen, but not gods. In his own work, you can hear echoes of their studio daring, especially in the way he layered textures and experimented with tones. But Beck always twisted those influences into something darker, stranger, and more aggressive. Where the Beatles aimed for universal appeal, Beck aimed for shock and awe. For Beck, the Beatles were proof that pop music could be high art, but also a reminder to never get comfortable with adoration. Innovation mattered more than praise, and that was a lesson he carried to the end of his career. Number 5, the Shadows. Long before Jeff Beck was melting amplifiers and redefining rock guitar, he was a teenager in England glued to the sound of the Shadows. With Hank Marvin's clean, melodic guitar lines on hits like Apache, the Shadows became one of the UK's first true guitar heroes. For Beck, hearing them was like discovering a new language, one he would spend a lifetime translating into his own dialect. The Shadows showed Beck that the guitar could be more than rhythm or background. It could carry the entire melody, stand at the center, and tell a story without needing a singer to fill in the blanks. That idea struck him hard. He once said, "Every note should mean something," echoing Hank Marvin's economy of phrasing. To Beck, there was no such thing as wasted space in music, but admiration soon turned into a personal challenge. While he adored Marvin's clarity and discipline, Beck wanted to take those clean lines and rough them up. He began experimenting with distortion, bending notes until they squealed, and pushing the guitar into emotional extremes the shadows never dared. If Marvin taught him the rules, Beck's instinct was to break them. There are stories of Beck in his earliest bands trying to mimic the Shadow's precision, only to get frustrated when he inevitably veered into chaos. That frustration was productive. It taught him that he wasn't meant to copy his heroes. He was meant to chase their spirit of innovation in his own way. Even later in life, Beck acknowledged the Shadows as one of the most important sparks that lit his fire. He rarely covered their songs directly, but the philosophy he absorbed from them, clarity, intent, and purpose in every phrase, never left his playing. The Shadows may have sounded polite compared to the ferocity Beck unleashed later, but they gave him his foundation. They proved that one guitar could command all the attention in the room. And for Jeff Beck, that was a revelation. Number 4, Led Zeppelin. When Led Zeppelin exploded onto the scene in 1969, they instantly became the loudest and most dominant rock band in the world. But for Jeff Beck, their rise was complicated. Jimmy Page, Zeppelin's guitarist and leader, had been his bandmate in the Yardbirds. Beck had watched Page step into his old shoes, then transform their shared legacy into something even bigger. The success was undeniable, but Beck couldn't help feeling both admiration and bitterness. The rivalry between Beck and Page ran deep. They had once been close friends, trading licks and pushing each other to experiment. But once Zeppelin took off, Beck was left in the shadow of a band that was filling stadiums and redefining hard rock. He reportedly told friends, "They're just my riffs with more volume," a biting dismissal that revealed how personal he took their success. Still, Beck couldn't deny their power. Zeppelin's combination of blues roots, heavy riffs, and thunderous rhythm was unstoppable. Songs like Whole Lotta Love and Dazed and Confused echoed some of the same experiments Beck had been exploring: distortion, sustain, feedback, but packaged in a way that was far more commercial. To Beck, that was both genius and theft. Behind the scenes, the tension showed. There were moments when Beck and Page nearly reunited musically, but egos and competition got in the way. Promoters loved to speculate about the two Yardbirds guitar gods sharing a stage, but Beck resisted, never wanting to be seen as Page's sidekick or afterthought. Their friendship, once rooted in shared curiosity, became defined by silent rivalry. Fans often debated the two as if they were opposite poles: Beck, the restless innovator, and Page, the master of building spectacle. Both were brilliant, but Beck seemed determined to prove he wasn't chasing Zeppelin's success. He preferred smaller stages, riskier music, and the kind of unpredictability Zeppelin couldn't afford once they became a global machine. In the end, Zeppelin's success was something Beck couldn't ignore, but also something he refused to replicate. He chose the harder road, the one that favored originality over stadium anthems, even if it meant being forever compared to his former friend. Number 3, Pink Floyd. By the early 1970s, Pink Floyd had become the architects of a new kind of rock, spacious, atmospheric, and deeply experimental. Albums like Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here transformed rock into something cinematic, and Jeff Beck took notice. For a guitarist obsessed with sound, Floyd's ability to create entire worlds in the studio was both inspiring and frustrating. Beck admired their willingness to treat the studio as an instrument. Much like the Beatles before them, Pink Floyd saw no limit to what could be done with tape, effects, and layering. But Beck was always a live performer at heart. While he respected the way David Gilmour sculpted guitar lines into textures, he sometimes dismissed Floyd's reliance on atmospherics. To him, it lacked the danger of a truly unpredictable performance. There are stories of Beck sitting in on their sessions in the mid-70s, quietly watching, as the band built up layers of sound. He was fascinated, but afterward he reportedly said, "It's beautiful, but it doesn't bleed." That one line summed up his critique. Pink Floyd's music was brilliant, but it didn't carry the raw wounds he believed music should reveal. Still, he couldn't deny their influence. Floyd's sense of scale and space pushed him to think differently about his own recordings. You can hear traces of that inspiration in albums like Blow by Blow, where Beck used silence and restraint just as effectively as distortion and volume. In that way, Floyd became an unlikely teacher, even if he never admitted it outright. Gilmour himself often praised Beck, citing him as one of the greatest guitarists alive, but the admiration wasn't equally returned. Beck respected Gilmour's taste and tone, yet privately felt his playing lacked aggression. For Beck, music was about risk, and risk meant stepping close to the edge of collapse. Floyd, for all their brilliance, never seemed willing to live that dangerously. For Beck, Pink Floyd embodied both the promise and the limitation of studio perfection. They were masters of sound, but he was searching for something messier, something more human. Number 2, Jimi Hendrix. Few guitarists shook Jeff Beck the way Jimi Hendrix did. By the late 60s, Hendrix was rewriting the rules of the instrument: feedback, distortion, wah-wah, even how the guitar was physically played. For someone as innovative as Beck, seeing Hendrix perform for the first time was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He later admitted, "He scared the shat out of me," a rare confession from a man not known for showing vulnerability. Beck recognized in Hendrix a kindred spirit, someone equally obsessed with pushing the guitar into uncharted territory. But where Beck was often restless and unpredictable, Hendrix seemed almost supernatural in his control of chaos. Every squeal of feedback, every dive of the whammy bar felt intentional, as if he was channeling the instrument rather than just playing it. Beck envied that mastery, even as he tried to outdo it in his own way. The press didn't help. As soon as Hendrix arrived in London, comparisons were inevitable. Critics and fans began debating who was the true guitar innovator, Beck or Hendrix. Beck hated the idea of being cast as second best, especially to someone who seemed to dominate the spotlight so effortlessly. Their relationship became a mix of mutual admiration and silent rivalry. Behind the scenes, though, there was respect. Beck and Hendrix crossed paths often, sharing stages and mutual friends. Stories suggest that while Beck quietly measured himself against Hendrix, Hendrix himself praised Beck's playing, calling him one of the few guitarists who truly impressed him. That didn't erase the tension, but it did make the rivalry more nuanced than simple jealousy. For Beck, Hendrix represented the ultimate challenge, proof that even the most fearless innovators could be overshadowed. He doubled down on his own path, experimenting with jazz fusion, instrumental albums, and sounds Hendrix never explored. In some ways, Hendrix forced Beck to carve out a lane that was uniquely his, ensuring he wasn't just the other guitar hero of the 60s. Hendrix's shadow loomed large, but Beck didn't run from it. Instead, he used it as fuel, pushing himself deeper into experimentation and ensuring his legacy stood apart. Number 1, Eric Clapton. Of all Jeff Beck's rivals, none defined him more than Eric Clapton. Their story began in the Yardbirds, where Clapton's departure in 1965 opened the door for Beck to join. That moment set the tone for a lifetime of comparisons. Clapton was God to his fans, the pure blues purist whose every note carried authority. Beck was the experimenter, the restless innovator who wanted to break rules rather than preserve them. The clash wasn't just musical, it was philosophical. Beck respected Clapton's technical skill and his deep love of the blues, but he often dismissed him as too safe. In interviews, Beck would praise Clapton's tone, then undercut it by saying he played within predictable lines. "He's a master of tradition," Beck once remarked, but tradition can be a cage. For Beck, music needed to evolve or it wasn't worth playing. Clapton's devotion to the past made him, in Beck's eyes, both admirable and limited. Their rivalry wasn't just in words. Every time one of them released a new record, the comparisons followed. Clapton had commercial success and critical acclaim, while Beck pursued riskier projects that often baffled mainstream audiences. It frustrated Beck to see Clapton celebrated as the definitive guitarist of their generation, even as he himself was pioneering techniques that would influence players for decades. Yet behind the rivalry was a strange kind of respect. The two would occasionally share stages, and when they did, it was electric. Beck would push himself harder, determined to prove he wasn't in Clapton's shadow. Clapton, for his part, admitted that Beck could do things on a guitar that no one else could touch. Their relationship was less about friendship and more about a lifelong competition that neither of them could escape. Fans often love to pit them against each other, but the truth is that Beck and Clapton needed one another. Clapton gave Beck a target to measure himself against, a constant reminder that safety was the enemy. And Beck gave Clapton a rival who kept him from becoming complacent. In a way, their tension fueled both of their legacies. For Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton was more than a rival. He was the mirror Beck refused to look like, a reminder of what he could have been if he had chosen the safer road. Instead, Beck chose the harder path, and it made his story unforgettable. Jeff Beck never played it safe. For him, music had to feel alive, risky, raw, and honest. If it didn't, he dismissed it. That's why he clashed with so many artists, even ones he admired. He respected bands like the Ventures, the Beatles, and Pink Floyd for pushing limits, but he also criticized them when he felt they fell short. Rivalries with players like Clapton, Page, and Hendrix weren't about ego alone. They were about standards. Beck demanded more from himself and from everyone around him. That mix of respect and rejection is what made him unique. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing sounds no one had heard before. And in that chase, he built one of the most original legacies in music history. In the end, Beck's story isn't about who he liked or hated. It's about his refusal to compromise. That's what made him both feared and admired, and why his influence will never fade. So, what do you think? Did Beck's sharp standards make him greater, or did they cost him even more recognition? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories from music's greatest legends.